Support for the podcast comes from Play at Home Physical and Occupational Therapy. Play at Home Physical Therapy strives to make life easier for your family by providing quality pediatric, physical, and occupational therapy for your children in the comfort of your own home. Dr. Stephanie Lynn is a board-certified doctor of physical therapy as well as owner and lead physical therapist of Play at Home, which provides home-based physical therapy services to children ages birth to 5 years in the greater Philadelphia area. The therapists at Play at Home have a broad range of experience and are skilled in treating many conditions common in children, including torticollis, plagiocephaly, developmental delay, hypotonia, cerebral palsy, autism spectrum disorder, sensory processing disorder, genetic disorders, neurologic disorders, feeding disorders, neuromuscular disorders, premature birth, fine motor delay, visual motor delay, and toe walking. Play at Home PT is passionate about helping children achieve their full potential through play-based therapeutic activities and supporting their families every step of the way. Learn more at playathomeft.com.
Hey, parents and professionals, and welcome back to Parenting Stuff I Wish I Knew Sooner and Want You to Know Now. I'm your host, Erica Desper, founder of the Center for Confident Parenting, and more importantly, a mom who seems to learn everything I need to know the hardest way possible and well after I need to know it. And I'm on a mission to help other parents and families avoid a similar experience. To that end, today I'm joined by Jaime Bassman, mom of one teenager and one young adult, and an occupational therapist with experience in an area that I want to make sure all families are aware of: infant and toddler early intervention. Jaime, thank you for joining me.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So my allergies are off the charts today. So if I sound funny or look funny, everyone just picture me on a better day. Before we dig into our topic, tell us whatever you want to share about yourself, your family, what brought you to doing this kind of work.
Okay. So, like you said, I am an occupational therapist, and I've been an OT for 22 years already, which is kind of crazy. And
dating yourself.
yeah. And I have done a lot of different things as an OT, although never any like traditional rehab stuff, as I tell people. But like basically, I've worked in infant toddler and preschool and school-based services. And I did some work with 18 to 21-year-olds in a private school setting. And I also have been very involved with the Jewish community, an organization called Jewish Learning Venture, where they have a whole community inclusion initiative. So I provided a lot of like training and support around that to, kind of like training a lot of religious school teachers about sensory integration. And during the pandemic, I also was involved. I kind of started my own little thing where I was consulting with parents about kind of like, how do you set up this room for your kid who's now like home doing school during COVID, and you're not sure like what the heck to do. Right. I know. And I'm like bringing back the bad memories. But I was an OT long before I had my own children, and then, subsequently discovered that, each of them, that they were neurodivergent, and that, kind of being a whole long, very different journey that I think has also like made me a better OT in a lot of ways. Now, in terms of how I got into OT in the first place, that's kind of an interesting story that actually begins with my birth, if you can believe that.
Okay. Wow. All right. I've got coffee. Let's hear it.
Yeah. So, when I was born, my mom it was very traumatic birth for my mom. Her uterus ruptured, and I was actually very sick. I had encephalitis. And the doctors were like, they were convinced that I actually was going to be severely disabled. And that was like kind of what they had told my parents. And so even though this was like, the late 70s, kind of like the Stone Age, relatively speaking, there were, like they would go to the neurologist for follow-up, and everyone sort of like had eyes on me. And obviously I was like doing like way better than anyone expected, because the doctors are always very like, the child will never be able to do this, that, or the other thing, right?
I mean, wasn't everyone just like institutionalized back then? Just forget you.
Yeah, right? Like it was just just that
Just a different
negativity.
time and place.
Yeah. Yeah, although the negativity is still kind of a thing.
Sure.
Yeah. So one of the things though that I did have was a little bit of a fine motor delay. And when I was around 3, and I actually went myself for occupational therapy, and I went to the like local hospital where the pediatrics department, and there was an OT, and I have pictures of like myself standing next to this blackboard in my bedroom, like, like working on like writing my name or something like that. And so fast forward, obviously, like quite a few years. I think I always knew that I wanted to do something in the like helping professions, right?
We're all
Something
helpers.
related to advocacy. And for whatever reason, I was in college and sort of like leaning, I knew psychology was interesting, and maybe I'd become a school psychologist. And I was home over winter break that year, and like I literally had a dream. It was just like a dream, like it was something about becoming an occupational therapist. And it just made sense, right? Like I woke up next morning during like winter break before I think my junior year of college, and I was like, this is it, right? And from there I'm like, all right, what prerequisites do I need to take? What should I do about graduate school? And
that's awesome. Well,
yeah.
not everyone has that meaningful of a story or a path. So that was
I
very
had
cool
a dream,
to hear.
yeah.
Right? And then the universe was like, as it often does, like, oh, you think you know things. Here come your kids, right? We're gonna test you to live it.
Yeah. One of the things that I also learned before I had kids, but it's really come in handy, was I had one of my field work. So when you're in OT school, you need to have 2 of these like 3-month long fieldwork experiences.
Yep.
And I had a fieldwork experience that almost killed me. Like, and I went and talked to the school and said, like, this is really like not okay to do this to people. It was literally, it was like a 10-hour day I was working, and I was expected to master like 3 different areas of practice, whereas other people, like, it's kind of like one area of practice and you're not taking on
Like,
your
let's
kids. Right?
focus.
And so it was like I was expected to do like I was like infant, toddler, early intervention, and school based, and like the private practice sort of sensory clinic thing. And I was just so overwhelmed by it all. And I was really like falling apart. It was very lucky that was actually the exact time when my, now husband like kind of came into my life. And it was, again, it was like, karma was just, I don't know if not karma, like it was just the right time.
Yeah.
But here's what I have learned, that emotional capacity and bandwidth are really crucial in life. And especially when raising kids with disabilities, that they have their own emotional capacity needs, that, like if they're in a place or a space where they don't have the emotional capacity because their sensory systems are overwhelmed, they're feeling cognitively overwhelmed by information, whatever it is, right? If they don't have the bandwidth, nothing else is going to work, right? Because your system is just on overload. And that's when, you're fight or flight, or you kind of get into this, as these guys, the Asperger, I don't know if you've heard of the Asperger experts, they call it like defense mode, right? Where,
Mm-hmm.
it's like other people are trying to get you to like do skills. Like grandma comes in to try to teach you to knit while you're on the front lines of a war, right? And you're like, no, grandma. So, what I learned from that experience is that I was going to do better as an OT if I focused on one practice area at a time, period. So that I felt like I could kind of focus on that and master that and not try to do too much at once. And over 20 years later, served me very well. And even with early intervention, I know my limits, and I'm able to, if there are times where I don't have the emotional capacity because of what's going on in my life or with my kids, and I need to decrease my caseload temporarily, I can do that. Right.
Yeah.
And then other times where I have more capacity, I can increase my caseload.
Yeah. It's such a good lesson to learn. I'll say early on, but I'm sure it was still hard earned, and good thing you learned it before all the things that were going to come, in your future, because as we know, parenting in general,
It's full of surprises.
Our bandwidth,
Yeah.
varies. Absolutely full of surprises. Well, that was all very, very cool. I'm glad the universe, guided you, gave you what you needed, guided you to where you needed to be. I'm sure it's been so helpful for other families. So thanks for helping us get to know you. Let's dig into our topic. So one of my big regrets and things that I wish that I learned about earlier on and could have accessed is the program we call early intervention. I even remember Googling at one point on this long journey with our son, like maybe early intervention just didn't exist when our son was in those years. Maybe that's why no one sent us there, right, and directed us to it. Unfortunately, that's not true. It did exist. I simply was not aware of it, and none of the people in our lives, professionals, teachers, doctors, nobody said anything about it. So I don't know how that happened. I can't go back and change it, but I just want to make sure that every parent and every professional, because I know many of them listen to this as well, is aware of what the program is, who it's for, how you access it. So what's a good explanation for someone who has no idea what we're talking about? What is early intervention?
So first of all, Erica, don't blame yourself.
I'm
you're
trying.
not alone. You're not alone.
Can I blame everybody else? I really blame it for that aspect. I blame everyone else.
So one of the things that I do love actually about a lot of these mainline parent, these Facebook groups, is that it has been so helpful, I think, in getting the word out.
And in all fairness, we did not have that. I got my first smartphone when my son was born. I believe I started using reluctantly Facebook a while after he was born, but it wasn't what it is obviously now. It was kind of in development. It was new. I didn't even know where to check my notifications. So we didn't have the benefit of this parent sharing, on social media that we have today.
So, what is early intervention? So first of all, I want to just make sure we're clarifying, and I know you'll repeat this again, that there are two different types of early intervention, right? To make things more confusing, right?
Right.
So today, right, what we're really focusing on is infant toddler early intervention, which is the system that is very, again, family-centered, developmental parent/caregiver coaching model that takes place in the home, daycare, or really any setting where a child and their family typically spends time specifically with other peers in the community, what's called natural environments. That can be anywhere from literally the therapist can go with you. I've been to Burger King, I go to playgrounds, I go to, community center art classes, I've been swimming, like wherever your family spends time, and it is really focused on routines that are challenging. And yes, you need to have a developmental delay of 25% or greater in at least two areas, or 33% in one area. Now, again, this is different depending on different areas.
Right. Because
Early
it is
intervention. So the infant toddler early intervention, just to kind of go back for a minute. Infant toddler early intervention, which is separate from the other early intervention, which is like what I call preschool based early intervention services.
right.
The infant toddler early intervention is based on a national mandate via, most people, who have a child with disability, they've heard of IDEA, right? And having an IEP when you go from ages 3 through 21, that's what's called IDEA Part B. That kind of outlines all the rules and regulations. However, there's also an IDEA Part C, right? It should be called IDEA Part A, but that's
What I thought
neither
you were
here nor there. So IDEA Part C mandates that every state set up an infant toddler early intervention program. It is completely free to families. And the money to pay for the interventions and services comes from the national government. Money flows down to the states, and then each state has its own, the different counties run and manage their own early intervention programs. And so OCDEL at the Pennsylvania level sort of tells each county what to do, and then the counties kind of come up with their own rules. But the key things to know, again, that this is free of charge, that we come to you wherever you are. This is not something where it's an office. If I come to a daycare, I'm not pulling the child out. I am meeting them where they are. That it is really a coaching model that's routines based, and it is very much family centered on the specific, usually routine based goal that the family comes up with. So when I say routines, that can also include things like being, communication and movement, but it's really about, is the child using more words or gestures during mealtime to ask for the food that they want? Is the child able to participate in diaper changes without having a meltdown, right? Those sort of very kind of concrete things. And it's really asking the family, what is it that is of concern to you? And that's sort of how things are determined, once it's determined that they're eligible. And there is a way of determining eligibility. So like if you don't qualify under these different delay areas, and that's I'll talk a little more about that when we talk about like eligibility, in terms of motor communication, right? Like cognitive, adaptive, or self-care, etc. Then there is also something called informed clinical opinion, where we could be like, okay, well, you don't qualify under the typical rationale. However, as an OT, I see that you're having some really severe feeding delays, right? Like that are impacting you. So, also if you have there are certain qualifying diagnoses that like right away, like, so basically if you're a baby with Down syndrome, right away you can qualify.
Right.
The bigger
But
question
for most everyone else, there'll be an evaluation process to determine that.
Yeah, well, you're still going to technically have an evaluation, even if you have one of those qualifying diagnoses, because the evaluation, and this is true no matter what, right? Like the services and goals are based on the assessment process, right? So that kind of has to happen in order for you to determine like what happens next. To go back to, and I want to speak to any mom who's kind of feeling like you do, where you're like, I didn't know about this. Nobody told me about this. Or, I actually found out through the experience of a relative of mine who lives in a different state that she was under the impression that unless her doctor referred her to early intervention, that it wasn't going to be an option otherwise. And I'm like, oh no, any parent, I want to say this, and I want to make sure
because I want everyone to hear it.
Any parent who has a concern can call up the intake number for early intervention services in their county and get their child evaluated. Full stop. You do not need to wait for the pediatrician. Period. Very important to know, because I think even some of the pediatricians either don't know that, or they do know that, but they don't really communicate that well with the families. So you have this whole
a mindset of which we talk about a lot on this podcast, and I'm going to have you weigh in on why that's not what we want to do. It's still very prevalent of we'll keep an eye on it. We'll wait and see.
There's a lot to be said. And I don't want to say anything that's going to offend any pediatricians. They're lovely people. They're very helpful for the things that they are helpful for as pediatric generalists. And I understand that this can be really hard. You see these families, they come in and out. It's a short period of time. You don't want to worry them.
Right.
The whole idea of early intervention is that we have the kind of nuanced clinical gaze upon a child that pediatricians, there's certain things that pediatricians are really good at looking at, right? Like that the rest of us don't. If I looked in your ear, I'm not going to be able to tell if you have an ear infection, right? It's not my thing.
Right.
But can I tell when I look at a child that they are not using their arms symmetrically and they are 10 months old and that is not typical? Yeah. And I think that, pediatricians are just trying to go on the guidance that maybe they've been given, and some of the guidance they've been given was not really informed by OTs or PTs or speech therapists. And it's too focused on milestones, right? Yes, everyone thinks about milestones because they're, that's what we're, that's the yardstick. That's what we have to go on. Where it's they're not doing this by this point, but this with it. The truth of the matter is, it's not just about they're not doing this specific milestone. It's really that there's a pattern that we see or look for that can't be necessarily distilled into he's not clap. It's not so helpful to me to just look at whether or not a child is clapping at X number of months. It's well, are they using any gestures to try to get their needs met, right? Because one thing people don't realize is that actually by 15 months, what we look for is to have about 15 gestures, right? Not on any of the lists. Not on the list. And most families, they don't think about gestures.
It's a little more nuanced than just, you have to boil it down to milestones. So there's these anchor points that everyone's looking for, but there's a lot in between, right?
What I would love to see is almost a system where, families could send in videos to if you have a pediatrician or pediatrics office that had somebody connected with them who could even just, watch the video, right? And be yeah. Cause if you sat me down with a bunch of videos like that all day, I'd be this one, yes, or
Well,
just
and
this one,
it's hard because there is always a wide range of typical.
yes, whatever
So you,
typical is, whatever normal is.
whatever, right, whatever we're going to use. And you really do need someone specialized that has the comparison of lots of kids,
Yeah.
needs to be able to look and say, yes, this is maybe just on the slower side of typical, and we can just keep monitoring it, versus like, no, it's even like a little less than the lower side of typical, and something needs to happen to bring them, into that range.
I think
Um,
doctors, pediatricians, to me, sometimes they focus on the wrong things. Like,
mhm.
you know, I, I think one of the things they do not focus on enough is the symmetry issue. Full
Mm,
stop. Like if a parent says to you as a pediatrician, like, oh gosh, my kid, I think they must be ambidextrous or so, because they're, they switch off and they use either hand for all sorts of things, and it's like the kid is like a little older and they don't have, I mean that like more like with it for a kid is older where you expect them to have like a hand preference, right? Or if you have like, again, like the other situation where the kid is like 10 months and the mom's like, oh, they must be right-handed. I'm like,
mm.
what do you
Handed,
mean? That
right, handed is
sort of
shouldn't say
thing,
better.
right? Because those are a lot of the kids that I tend to see in early intervention where I'm like, this is why early intervention is important.
Yeah.
Because often, sometimes with these kids that have the symmetry issues, and we look a little more into it, and it's like, oh, interesting. There's some symmetry issues with the legs and the arms. And then sometimes they will have they'll get in for like an MRI and be like, oh, you know what? There was a brain bleed that nobody even knew about, right? Like,
So, and I appreciate, I wanted to go back to, you mentioned the meltdown, the famous word meltdowns, right? Which can mean different things to different people. We don't all use the same words, but that was our first clue that something was going on. And as a first time parent who was trying to be a really chill first time parent and felt like I was in the know, etc., I was like, look, I just have a really high need, highly sensitive child. And that's why these things are so hard for him. When we tried to move toward dropping him off at preschool, separation was intensely, brutally painful for all of us. He screamed and cried hysterically. They had to pry him off of me. And a lot of families go through that at first, but then it eases with predictability and exposure. And like, that's where I thought we were headed. But he did that for the entire first year of preschool, for the entire summer
right,
of
it
summer
was a
camp,
long time.
the entire next year of preschool. And then I rationalized it. I was like, well, we're fortunate to have family in the area. He's never been left with a babysitter. He's never this, he's never that. He's always with me. Like maybe I just set him up to have this hard experience, I'm blaming myself. But it wasn't getting any easier. And then of course we moved from preschool to standard school, public school, and then he would have meltdowns each morning, and each afternoon he'd kind of have that after school restraint, collapse. Of
And
course,
that, by the way, emotional capacity,
it was
bandwidth, right?
emotional
When
capacity.
you've used up your whole battery
Yeah,
at school, you come home, right?
right. And what he was using it up for was the sensory piece. He is a sensory seeker and a sensory avoider, fun combination. So he was completely overloaded, and he was anticipating that overload, which is why they had to pry him off of me. And had we known that, had anyone identified that, he could have had a far less traumatic experience, as could I have. And because it was missed, it then just manifested in different ways as he matured. It looked different, it sounded different, it felt different. And it took till third grade to figure that piece out. And then there were many pieces, after that. So I just want parents to hear it isn't always something physical like the symmetry, although I think that's just as important. It isn't always, they're not using words yet and their peers are, and is that normal? It could be as simple as this kid is melting down all the time, and I don't see other kids doing that at all, or doing it as often, or doing it in the same scenarios. If it's taking over your life like that, like this was a time and place in our life where like that's what what we were dealing with. And I, as a babysitter, which in another life I was a babysitter and then a nanny, I had twins that I babysat. This was my first time hearing about early intervention. The little girl had several what I thought were unusual behaviors. She was very specific in how you had to deal with her. For example, if we took a walk in the stroller, if at any point we turned around and went back the way we came, she would have a meltdown. And I even tested this out. I was like, I can't believe what the mom is telling me. Like, this sounds weird. I'm going to try some experiments. I would even like cross the street so it would look different before turning back the way we came, and still, right? So, and they reached out to early intervention, and she did have some things that needed to be worked through. So it can be those kind of unusual things where you're like, is my kid just weird?
So this is the biggest thing, and it is the most challenging thing, I think, for all of us, right? And this is like a bigger conversation on the national stage, right? About neurodiversity and human difference is temperament, right? So the way that I put it, like both with sensory processing differences as well as just all differences, right? Is that, we're all different as humans. You and I, we're different from each other. Our brains work differently, right? We have different strengths, needs, processing differences, right? The question is, at what point is something impacting your life and
Yes,
function
that's what I'm trying to
significantly
articulate. Thank you.
enough,
Yeah.
significantly enough that you need support, that your child needs support, strategies? I want to emphasize that I don't look at this as fixing, right? Because and one of the things that I have learned, especially I've learned from autistic adults, and they have been the best teachers, right? Is the idea of how do you really support someone, right? It's about strategies and supports that they consent to, that are supporting their ability to function in order to do the things that to engage in the occupations that are important to them, or, again, early intervention, important to their families. And we all have different temperaments. And this is where it gets super confusing, right? Like, cradle to grave, any given individual has differences in temperament, right? Like their activity level, sensory sensitivity, and that reactivity, right? Flexibility and openness to new things. Those are all temperamental differences. Easy to, versus, slow to warm up. Temperamental differences. So in early intervention, I look at kids often where those temperamental differences, if we put aside diagnosis for a minute, right? Because what is diagnosis? Diagnosis is something that serves a purpose, right? It has to serve a certain purpose, right? To be useful. But if we put that aside for the moment, because in early intervention, it's not so much about the diagnosis, it's about what's going on with these differences that are impacting upon the daily routines where this child and family need support. And are those essentially often delays? Yes, right?
Sure.
But that's really what people are here for, is, we have this approach which tells people that early intervention is about, milestones. It's about delays and milestones. But in truth, it's also really about how to make life go more smoothly.
And I love your point of like, what if something's feeling unsmooth? to the point that I was describing was taking over
That's
everyone's
right. That's a more
bandwidth.
extreme thing, right? Like when you
That's
talk about like
extreme.
this has been going on for a year and the
Right.
intensity is what it is, right?
The
That's more
duration,
extreme
the intensity
version
of
of
pregnancy.
like the kid that, you know, has some trouble for even like a month or so. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's the piece that parents are like, well, how do I know? You know, like how much bandwidth is it taking up? How long has it been going on? How often are you seeing it? How intense does it stay? That should have been a clue, and I'm not going to beat myself up. That it was more, it wasn't just about, yes, it was about his temperament, but it wasn't only about his temperament. That probably ramped things up. But it was more, you know, more than that. Why? So we talked a little bit about like wait and see versus obviously the program's called early intervention for a reason. What has been found or established that alerted, you know, the national government to say like, whoa, we need this option C because the earlier we intervene, what does it turn out? Kids then don't need the other part of it and they get brought up to speed. Does it turn out it's just smoother to then move on? Like, what is so important about getting these supports and information as early as the family needs it?
Well, I mean, there's two different questions there, which is like
Yeah.
kind of like the background and history of IDA, which
Right.
is still not fully funded, by the way. Which is right. And then there's the question of what is it about doing this at a certain age, you know, earlier, getting the support, you know, earlier on that is helpful. So I think one of the things from a practical standpoint is that the infant toddler early intervention system is the only system that's really set up to support families in a much more direct, hands-on way. And getting that kind of
And in that natural environment. Because if I go
in
get
the
private
natural
OT,
environment.
I'm going to the office.
Right. So even if you go to like, even if you take your like 2-year-old to like a private OT or a private speech therapist, even then it's not a natural environment, right? And it's not you getting the same level of hands-on training and coaching to support your parenting of this child. So it's really, in a lot of ways, it's parenting support. And the more that you as a parent have strategies in your pocket as early as possible, the more that the trajectory, right? Like it helps you as a parent to kind of have a better sense of how to support this child. I mean, statistically, yes, like there are statistics that say, you know, kind of like the earlier you intervene. There's also sometimes, though, a little bit of confusion with, is it about the timing or is it also about the frequency? And that's an interesting question because I think the frequency, you can have a lot of service in terms of people coming in and working with your child. But unless you as a parent are actively embracing that your own role in the intervention, where you are saying, okay, I'm going to do this coaching thing and it's not necessarily comfortable for me. Because for a lot of people, right? Like the idea of somebody coming into your house is so vulnerable in the first place in so many ways, right? Like, and I feel that with so many of
I'm
my
sure I
friends,
felt
you know.
that way at one time, but we're so over it now. We have so
Right,
many people come
right.
into our house.
But a lot of times, like people feel like that I'm going to judge them. I'm going to judge the way their house
and
looks.
you're worried about how your house looks, and
Right.
is this my fault?
Right. But, you know, again, and this is where obviously the fact that like I have been there and I continue to be there, that's just where I am in life, like that helps too, in understanding, and kind of meeting them where they're at. But it's really, the more the parent kind of gets involved and, practices the strategies, and we refine things there, and they're able to kind of like hear the feedback from the therapist and maybe try it again, and kind of when they get there, and or the family or the childcare provider, again, that's a whole different ball of wax, coaching with childcare providers. But the more that the family like really says to themselves, okay, this week I'm going to practice this and I'm going to integrate it into this routine, because that's kind of how we roll in early intervention, is like, there's no exercises. This isn't like a thing where like we do exercises, right? This is not meaningful. It's more like what little, and I say little, like sometimes it's often little things that somebody's already doing that we sort of like just tweak a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things, because it sounds very backwards to people, that I coach families on to help their child that they want to communicate more, you need to use less language yourself.
So true. And it's so hard.
Yes. Yeah. So
particularly
I
for
can
my
come
kind
in
of
there,
he gets
and
flooded.
I can come in there, right? Like, and do my, I'm like, I like to joke about the pixie dust thing, especially OTs. People think that we have all this pixie dust, right?
Right.
It's like
Parents
a thing.
think that
You're
about
like, oh,
my sleep-in potty services too.
Right. You know how it is. But at the end of the day, right? Like, I'm just coming in once a week, and I'm just really here to support you. And it's really about like, are you embracing this? Are you embracing this process? Are you, and again, it's not like, do what I'm suggesting or you're going to fail. Like I kind of check in and we tweak things. Oh, that didn't really work out. That didn't really fit in. It doesn't really fit, like, and I meet them where they're at. And we're like, let's try something else, But I also see lots of families where we come in, or even like, the kid might be getting, like 5 or 8 or 10 hours a week of some sort of direct intervention that's about, it's not about the child and their family. It's really about the child and the therapist. And those circumstances, I mean, again, you could say that the more therapy a child gets, the better they're going to do. That doesn't always take into account their emotional capacity. And it's a little, but it's really more about, the more that the family kind of goes with strategies that they've been shown, that they feel comfortable implementing, that work for the child. And, that's when you start to see the progress.
Well,
and also the family feels empowered.
Yes.
If somebody is working with your child directly, one-to-one, and you don't know what they are doing, that's not empowering. I'm not saying there's not potentially a place for it.
Right.
You
and
need
it's
to
isolated.
make sure
then
it's
you
working
can't be
for your
practicing
child's emotional capacity.
Between.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean you're going to feel empowered as a parent. And often what happens is parents then feel more reliant on some sort of the same sort of thing throughout their kid's whole life. Like I as a parent feel disempowered in my role, and now I need to feel reliant on somebody else who has magic pixie dust to fix things.
That's a good point. Yeah. Well, and also something I started to understand about delays from talking to so many people like yourself is mastering one thing, of course, is tied to the next thing. So even though it's easy to say like, oh, they just don't have as many words as their peers by the time they catch up, like whatever, there's other things that it's like a domino effect, right? So, well, maybe now my social interactions are impacted, and maybe now I can't share, and maybe now I'm hitting, and like it just,
I
start
think of it more
to
as like a tapestry. Everything,
okay,
and I tell
good.
people this with diagnoses too. Like when people are like listing off like 20 different diagnoses their kid has. Like, you know what? It's the tapestry of neurodiversity and just the
Yeah.
diagnoses are just different threads, right?
Yeah.
But these things do, right, like they interact with each other in ways that people don't always understand.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we aren't getting the one delay, if that's what it is, up to speed early, which is the goal of this, then we may end up with multiple delays and they kind of all need to be, brought up. So definitely, if you've listened to any of this podcast, you know by now I'm not a fan of wait and see. So let's say a parent is listening and they're like, that thing that's been bugging me, like, this is for me. I want to get this checked out. Can you briefly walk us through the process? And caveat, I want to tell parents, it is a little complicated. We do have a page for families in the greater Philadelphia area to access their county's, phone number or whatever it is that they need. So I'll put that in the show notes. But aside from that, getting that contact information, what does the process look like? The timeline, like what's a parent's first step and what happens after that, which I'm sure varies.
Great. Yeah. That's a great question. And first of all, like about the wait and see thing, right? Like, I don't know. I can't really think of anyone that, like, of all the families I've ever worked with where they've regretted calling,
Yeah, right.
they've
Like
regretted getting the evaluation.
and you're right. Or you have the peace of mind of like, we checked, you're good. Like there's nothing really to worry about. Like,
Right.
that's the only two ways it can go.
Right.
What is the harm?
This is free. There's not like you're shelling out $3,000 here for an evaluation. This is like we come to your house, we play with your child,
There
and
really
we get a
is
sense of where they're at, and that's really the only commitment.
such a good
And we're not diagnosing them. That's not
right.
within my scope, is to give them some specific diagnosis, right? It's just kind of what's going on. And spidey senses tend to be spidey senses tend to be accurate. So okay, basically you call up, and again, this can differ a little bit county by county,
Sure.
but the general gist is you call up. Each county has an intake hotline. You call up, you speak with someone and do an intake. They will ask you a whole bunch of questions and they'll go through sort of a screening, usually something called the ages and stages, to just kind of get some basic, kind of information on your child's developmental status.
Right.
From that, they will assign your child to somebody who's called a service coordinator. Service coordinator is someone who is a county employee. They don't work for any specific agency. They are a county employee, usually someone with a background in social work, education, every once in a blue moon, a background in therapy, that is, trained to be essentially a case manager for, and this is true even if your child doesn't qualify, there's still a service coordinator who, is assigned. And they also make the decision about who is going to be evaluating your child. So generally in Pennsylvania, you need to have two people. So it's usually you have a motor therapist, like, so maybe like a physical therapist, as well as a speech therapist, from the evaluation team. It really depends on what the needs are. That's how they make the decision about who comes out. And so those two people and the service coordinator, there is usually, it can be, I think, I don't know if it's up to 30 to 45 days from intake to, when the date is, but they try to get you scheduled for that evaluation as quickly as possible. And I haven't really heard anyone complain too much about the wait with that. It's been like pretty smooth.
I was going to ask about that, so I'm glad you touched on it.
Yes. So then they come out to your house and they complete a process. Again, every county is a little different with the tools they use, but what's usually used is something called the DACY. Now, I think of the DAISY as a little more of a screen, truthfully, than a real assessment tool. That's just me. But basically, you need to have a tool where you can determine eligibility based on whether or not, like, do they have a delay in social, emotional, cognitive, which is really kind of like a hodgepodge of things, fine motor, gross motor, and also adaptive. I'm like, did I leave anything out? And then communication.
We won't know if you do.
Yeah, in communication, you also have two things. This is also important. Parents often don't realize that communication, you have what's called receptive language and expressive language that you need to look at. So basically, receptive is what are they understanding, which is the foundation of all communication. So that's the other thing, by the way. Number one thing, if any parents like, my child's not talking, okay, the number one advice I will give any family is go to an audiologist and get the child's hearing tested. Not because anyone thinks they're deaf or hard of hearing. I understand that maybe there wasn't an issue with, with their newborns, right? Nobody thinks about this, but there is a very good chance that the child is not talking yet because they're not hearing things completely correctly. There's fluid in their ears. There's something else going on.
Or in our case, his hearing is perfect, but what he hears once it reaches his brain, it's a processing issue. So every time his hearing was checked, he was fine.
Well, and that's, to be honest, a child with processing issues is, it'd be great if an audiologist could pick up on that just from a test alone. That's something I tend to be able to sometimes notice those differences in kids, but that can be tricky.
Some can. We have connected with one who can, but it is more specialized than just I think you're run of the mill.
Yeah, and not at the age that I'm talking about. Like, definitely not at that.
Yes, we did that at 14.
So, but the number one thing I would tell people over and over again, it gets missed, and sometimes it's not even mentioned by the evaluators, which just stuns me, is to have the family, and you can get into the audiology department pretty quickly at Chopper Nemours, unlike with anything else.
Yes, right.
And just get that sense, and like, oh gosh, they're not responding to their name, and the parent was like freaking out about all the reasons why, maybe not realizing that they had fluid in their ear.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so intake, which should happen within
intake,
this amount of time.
Then you have the evaluation. So the evaluation can go again, one of a few ways. It could be that the child already has a condition that, even if the numbers don't add up because they have Down syndrome, because they were premature, that can also be, a reason why, right away they can qualify for support, or at the very least for something called monitoring, which I'll talk about afterwards. But or they have, again, they clearly have a delay in, that's significant enough in at least one of the areas, the 33% is often the threshold in different states, or 25% in two areas. And at that point, it's like, okay, congratulations, you qualify. What happens then, and I wish it did not happen the same day, because again, emotional capacity / bandwidth. This is one of my things of like, if you could change anything about the early intervention system, I'd be like, don't hold the IFSP meeting right after the evaluation.
Right.
No. But anyway, they do. So anyway, like the right then and there, it's like, okay, now we're going to move on to what's called the IFSP, not to be confused with the IEP, right? The same general idea. This is the intervention plan.
Early version of it, yeah.
But for birth to 3, it is called an IFSP. Again, it's much more family centered, etc. The first question that besides like kind of like tell me about your routines or like et cetera, et cetera. So the first question that will be asked of this parent who is like probably feeling a little exhausted because as part of the screening, they've already been asked like a bajillion questions. The
Sure.
first question is, all right, so parent, what's your goal? What do you want for your child?
And you're like, I haven't even had time to process that I need to have a goal.
Yes. And so like the obvious thing, right, is, usually the parent will be like, I want my child to walk. I want my child to talk.
I want to be able to drop him off without like all the rigmarole.
Right. Like that's, yeah. And
Separate without drama.
But that's actually a really great context related goal. Like a lot of times, like parents will say things, but they need a little bit of help to really think about the context of it.
Yes.
Right. Of like, okay, so you want your child to talk so that they can do what during what activity, right?
Right.
Like so that they're, during mealtime, they're, they can, say, banana or whatever.
I want my cup or whatever.
Right. So another thing that you may or may not be aware of personally, Erica, is that like so many parents, so many times, what happens sometimes during these evaluations is that they'll ask about sleep routines. And the parent might be like, my child doesn't sleep at all, right? Or like, blah, blah, blah. And then, they'll be like, oh, that's too bad your child doesn't sleep. But anyway, let's focus on their attention and imitation skills. And so like because this is the other thing. Sometimes what's really supposed to happen is that the parent in their own words is supposed to like sort of drive the goals. But also sometimes I'll see these goals that are written and I'm like, what's going on here? I'm like, the parent was not the one who said that the kid is going to imitate 5 actions.
Right. Yeah.
During play.
Exactly. And I mean,
it's great to focus on things during play, but it's obviously play is crucial. It is not the only thing. One of the things that I say to families is I say, look, you want to work on sleep? Let's work on sleep. Because here's the other thing. If we don't work on sleep, like sleep is kind of necessary to improve the attention span of any human being.
Worked with families where we've improved sleep and whatever therapies they're working on, they take this huge leap and they're out.
Yes.
Like all they needed was sleep
yes,
for the other things to be able to come together. And it's we didn't know that was going to happen, but it's like, wow, look what we did. It's amazing. I mean, it's such a human thing. Obviously, if you're not sleeping, your development is going to be impacted, but parents do miss that piece and professionals miss that piece.
And even in the early intervention system, it really frustrates me that there's not more focus on things like sleep. Like they have a protocol for working on feeding, because that's the other thing, right? Like it's like if you're not sleeping well and you're not eating well, and often those two things will bounce off of each other, then you're not going to pay attention while you're playing. You're not going to imitate 5 actions.
And you can be too tired to focus on eating well without a feeding delay. But if you also have some sort of anatomical issue or whatever, like that's just too many challenges stacked together.
Yeah. So, and we can focus on sleep, but also like, as you know, like we need help too, because I'm also not the person who
we all have our hats.
Like that, like, and I've been sort of like learning as I go along. Right. But like, like, I think that one of the things when these parents go through this, like, this goal setting thing, usually, so again, they do that, the IFSP is developed, and like based on the goals, right? Then the team, and it should be the team and the parent, but it's often the team, as in the service coordinator, they kind of decide, so which interventionist is going to be the best person to address this issue.
Right.
And so basically, they and will happen is that, you have a child maybe who has some sort of a motor issue where like they're not crawling yet, and they also have a feeding issue. And so somebody's like, let's bring out the occupational therapist because they can kind of do both of those things, even though
And are
like at the end of the
families
day, I'm going to
given
need some support.
multiple? Are you ever having like multiple providers coming from different angles, or are they trying to find one person that can address all the goals?
So it depends on the county. Counties also want to save money.
Sure.
So what often happens is that I will like often the OT will be one of the first people in there if there's either it's a baby with both a motor and a feeding delay, or also there's some issues around communication, but also around their attention and the sensory piece.
Okay.
So that like usually it's like an occupational therapist and also what's called a special instructor, who is a person with a background usually in early childhood education, who is not a speech language pathologist, whose focus is on sort of like the play and usually like again that imitate 5 actions sort of thing and the gestures, right. And they're like a little more of a generalist. So usually what happens is they will put in maybe 2 people, maybe it might be weekly, it might be every other week, but you know they're not going to put in 3 or 4 at once. And so but it's like every 3 months there's a process called the quarterly review. And usually it's, you know, that's when you sort of review the goals, you review the progress, and, you know, and everyone kind of, you know, talks together. And, you know, if at that point that there's a need for a different person to come in, maybe they just come in for what's called like a consultation, where it's just like a few sessions over time, you know, both with the family and with the other provider, or that service gets added. Like I do definitely have a lot of kids where it's like, you know, they might just start with OT and I'm like, I know just looking at them, like they're a kid who eventually is going to have, it's going to be OT, PT, speech, special instruction.
But the goal would be we combine all that over a period of time to reach these goals and they improve out of needing the system at all. Like if it worked perfectly.
So a lot of the kids, right. So we have some kids where, and I can usually pinpoint like pretty early. I'm like, this is a kid where like maybe it'll be 3-6 months tops, right? And they'll, you know,
that's another thing I think is helpful for parents to know. This is not necessarily like a lifelong, super involved,
right. It does not go on your, it does not go on your resume or your
ideally
your child's
it's
resume,
isolated,
transcript.
Right.
Like no.
Targeted, we're in, we're out.
Right. And then there are kids where like I kind of know I'm like we're going to be here with 3 and we're going to do. No, this is the other thing that can be very very helpful about the being in the birth to 3 system, is that as when the child is 2.5, there is a meeting between the service coordinator for birth to 3 and the service coordinator for 3 to 5. And they meet with the family and they set up a time for that child to be evaluated by the intermediate unit, or, you know, in different states, it's called something else, but every county in Pennsylvania, it's an intermediate unit, right? To see if that child qualifies for continuing in the 3 to 5 system.
Because the intermediate period is you are no longer birth to 3, but you are also not
you are not school aged. Correct.
Kindergarten and correct. Like where do we go?
Yes, intermediate. There you go.
Got it.
So
that was one of my questions coming up. So I'll take that.
Yes. So one of the things that happens in birth to 3 is that we are there in the home literally and support families over this. And it's really a 6-month process from the time that they have this like initial phone call and kind of like find out more about what, you know, what preschool services look like, to the point where what's supposed to happen is that by the day before that child's 3rd birthday, which is the last day in which they can receive birth to 3 services, things should be all taken care of and smooth for them to literally start the next day or as soon as possible with like where the plan is in place. So basically they should have been evaluated. They should have had the IEP meeting. Theoretically, the family is in agreement with the IEP. Everyone's on board with the plan. They've signed, you know, like that NOREP. And
this is when it switches from an IFSP to an IEP, although it's just different words.
Right. There's no IFSP after the third birthday, unless the only thing that does happen is if you have a family where either the IU kind of messed up on the timing, and because it happens, and they didn't get that child evaluated. So basically, or something happened where by the third birthday, they're not ready for that transition, or the family is not in agreement with the evaluation, the IEP, the recommended placement. And then the family, although this has to happen before the third birthday, can go and say that they want what's called pendency, where their services in the IFSP remain the same. They may or may not have the same early intervention provider still working with them, but they are still eligible to continue with that until things are worked out, which should not be a long process. That should be hopefully, sometimes it's about bus transportation, things like that.
What if someone's listening today and their child, they didn't know any of this, they never got in the Birth to 3 program, their child is 3 years and 1 day. Can you still start from the evaluation and beyond with the intermediate?
So once your child is 3, then you need to go through the intermediate unit to get evaluated for preschool. So
it's not like you just won't be part of the program we've been talking about up to now, but there's still a program and you can start fresh there.
Absolutely. Then you start. So the biggest thing to know, the biggest difference between the 3 to 5 preschool early intervention versus the birth to 3 is that it is educationally relevant. So basically, I had mentioned IDA Part C. Once you are age 3 through the age of 21, right? Like those transitional ages, those services are under IDA Part B. You have an IEP, and everything is about access to your education and special education services.
Whereas before, the focus was on the family, the natural environment. The focus shifts more to the child and the school.
And then, so first the focus is on the family, and now all of a sudden, surprise,
which
what
I know is
you
hard
want as the family does not matter as much to the system. It's really about the educational piece. And that is one of the reasons I work in early intervention, is that I am here to support the families when they figure that out, which is hard.
Right. Okay. And then you mentioned, obviously, because this is funded or semi-funded and national and county and all that, there have to be lots of rules and laws and thresholds. So tell me if this is the correct statement. It is highly possible that a child doesn't necessarily meet the threshold, but a parent and family is still being impacted by this issue, these concerns, whatever. What can a parent do at that point, or what's your advice for them? It could still be problematic, but not at the threshold level.
Right. So the threshold, like I said, there's like the numbers threshold, and then there's what's called the informed clinical opinion threshold, which is like they're not meeting the numbers, but the person who comes out for the evaluation says, I think that for my clinical opinion that they still benefit. So if you don't qualify for services, right? You evaluate, you don't qualify for service. First of all, it could just be that the evaluation happened at the wrong time. Because sometimes it's just about the items on the checklist and where your child is at. This can happen a lot between the ages of 12 and 18 months, where maybe they're evaluated, but like they just, they don't, it just doesn't work out. But, in another 6 months, maybe if you did like a reevaluation, which you could,
so that's an option.
Like don't say like, oh, I was evaluated once by birth to 3. It didn't work out. I'm never going to try it again.
Good.
It could, you could still go back. But there are lots of other options. And then I also have families that do birth to 3 early intervention, and they also supplement with
Yes.
private therapy.
I hear that a lot.
One of the biggest things I would say is, that there are private, like Ivy Rehab, which used to be Theraplay, right? They take medical assistance along with lots of other insurances. There are other therapists that take insurance, but usually you need to have some sort of infrastructure. So usually it's very hard to find a private therapist who takes insurance that's not part of some bigger conglomerate,
Right.
because you need somebody that can do all the medical coding and billing.
Yes.
Right. But again, are there private pay people? There are people who you can submit something to your insurance for some reimbursement. There are definitely, especially in our area, in suburban Philadelphia, luckily a lot of different options. And thank you, Erica, for
trying to bring
get
them
the word
all
out about all those
in
people.
central location.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because that's what I would love to get across today. Let's say, first of all, I want everyone to know about this if they don't know about it, know how it works, not be intimidated, and know that it may be a good fit for them. But if it's not, I don't want them to go through all this and be like, oh, great, we did that, we didn't qualify. That does not mean that gut feeling that we've been talking about isn't right. It's just a matter of like, that may not be the way it can be addressed. But if you're still concerned, it's still feeling like it's so problematic. Yes, there are other, it's nice to have it covered, but there are other avenues.
And families should keep that in mind if their children are school age too, that it could be that your child does not fit into one of those discrete educational disability categories in order for them to have an IEP. Right. That doesn't mean that you can't just go and get your child private services.
Because there's this much funding and it's already not enough, and they have to have rules for where it's going to go. Right?
Well, you could have me back next month to talk about school-based and all the issues with that. But when parents hire an advocate, or somebody, and they're fighting for, because they didn't qualify for the services. And sometimes, especially if your child has a learning disability, like, you fight away, right? Because like your child's education is being severely impacted by this, that, and the other thing. But if it's for something like OT and it's like a handwriting thing, like, instead of spending your money on an advocate, just go to somebody privately, and get some more
and to the point you made earlier, they're only, OT can encompass so much.
Yes.
School-based OT is going to focus on stuff that impacts academics, like handwriting.
They can only, school-based can only focus on the sensory piece, even in like whatever that looks like within the confines of school. Right. And getting, so in our case,
and in the early stage, it wasn't showing up at school. It was really, really showing up at home, and he was kind of masking. So we needed help, but it wasn't the help that they would provide. It just is really, it's definitely a little complicated.
Well, I think I'll just, go, and I know our time is probably almost through, but I think I'm just gonna...
you might get the award for the longest one.
Wow. All right.
I'll have to go back and check. I only have one question for you.
I'll circle back to the point around bandwidth, because, and it's something with both of my own kids that I really try to emphasize with them. And it's something that I emphasize with my early intervention families. And I think with anyone, when your kid is struggling, or with any human being who is struggling, right? Like, before deciding that, through your lens, that they're not doing what you want them to do, whether it's, a parent in early intervention sessions who's not as engaged, or maybe not like following through with strategies, or if it's a kid who's like making it through the day and then they come home and they crash and their parent is really frustrated. It really does go back to, we all only have so much emotional capacity and bandwidth, and your battery needs to be charged. And that's really the point, I think, about sensory that gets missed, is like, sensory is really about how, like, what is your processing capacity looking like, either for like this external stimuli, which you may need to shut out or you might need more of, or, you're processing for just being able to do a thing. And, even too, with services, right? Like your kid may or may not need to have all these services to benefit too. So like give yourself some grace if your kid can only manage, they only have the emotional capacity for like a little bit, or maybe you need to wait another month before you call early intervention because you don't have the emotional capacity to participate in that right now, and that's okay too. Yeah. So my awesome. Major thing is emotional capacity. Keep that in mind.
Love it. Clearly I'll need to have you back to explain more, but that was super. There were things I wasn't even clear on. So that was very, very helpful. Hopefully people can listen through the whole thing or, break it up, whatever you need to do. My last question for you is more of a personal question because obviously you've seen many families go through this, but you are on a journey with your own family. So what is one thing that you have learned along your own parenting journey that we really haven't said yet or touched on yet that you would love parents to hear today before we sign off?
Oh gosh.
You gotta boil it down to one.
I was very fortunate to, well, I'll try one and a half things. Okay. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Oh,
it's a marathon, not a sprint. I think is crucial. It kind of goes to that capacity piece too, right? And also I think if I had to end on one note, and I know I already said this, but it bears repeating over and over. I think for any parent, no matter how young your child is, if you are concerned about autism or your child is diagnosed with autism or whatever it is, listen to autistic adults, look for autistic adult voices. Like they're everywhere. They're on Instagram and TikTok. Yes, but they're also books and research. And that is the number one thing I think that will help a parent to truly have a good understanding of their child and their needs and help that parent, I think, reframe everything in a different way. So that is the advice that I often give to people is,
I appreciate
to look into, again, understand autistic adults, neurodivergency. It will reframe everything for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie. This was
Thank you.
Helpful. Now we all have a lifeline if we're not understanding this process. Parents, thank you for listening. I hope that even one person hears this and starts their journey and accesses this program like we were not able to. And if that can happen, it's healing. I know it sounds cliche and cheesy, but it would be healing for me to take our journey and all the feelings I have surrounding it, the resentment, the guilt, the frustration, and just pour it into but I can use this to benefit somebody else. So thank you for being part of that mission today. Parents, as always, I will leave you with my list, my short abbreviated list of things that I learned too late and wish I knew sooner. Number one, trust your gut. That's so applicable to what we were talking about today. Not only trust your gut, but be the squeaky wheel if people are poo-pooing your gut feelings and telling you wait and see, or you're just being a helicopter, or all the things that I've heard along the way. You're just a first-time parent. Trust your gut, be the squeaky wheel. Number two, you cannot pour from an empty cup. And this is what you were referring to with the emotional bandwidth. We get so focused on making sure our kids are okay and our partners and all of that, but we also can't clean with a dry sponge. That's another one that's really helpful for me. Like you've got to replenish. Otherwise, not only will you burn out and be miserable, but you just can't do all the things that we need to be doing and give to all the people we need to be giving to. And of course, there is no one way to be a perfect parent. Our kids don't want perfect parents anyway. There are countless ways to be a really good one, and loads of people that can help. So Jamie, thank you for being part of that today.
It's my pleasure.
And listeners, I will be back soon with lots more great stuff that I and others wish that we knew sooner and want you to know now. Thanks, everybody.